Welcome to the AIAEB 2023 lecture series, Leaders Shaping Our Community. We've been doing this lecture series, the sixth one of the series of 9, and exciting to be able to highlight higher education. My name is Brian Strazik. I'm
okay, so let's look here.
Also the AIAEB 2022 board president. As board president, I had 2 goals. One was to get some office space, so we moved from downtown Oakland to Berkeley. And you guys are also in the office space, so congratulations for having us. Secondly, I wanted to reach out to our complete chapter region. So we're a chapter that expands, it's 4 counties. So we go from Napa to Solano to Alameda and Contra Costa County. So it's a really big region, and we were able to go to all 4 counties, have events there, talk to members, which is really rewarding. Thank you. And then lastly, I want to create a lecture series to highlight the people who really help shape the spin and really promote the space, promote the people who are working here, and continue those conversations that we had in all those counties. So tonight is, like I said, number 6 of our 9-part series. This series is honoring architects, landscape architects, educators, just people who have helped to influence and really shape where we're living. We have a great set of panelists, and I'm pleased to introduce. We have Emily Marthinsen, we have Bill Glass. So going down the row here, Janet Tam, Gary Strang, and Renee Chow. I could spend all day. I spend a whole hour and a half presenting to your portfolios and what you've done, your accolades, but I'll try to keep it short. So Emily retired in 2018, and your title was really long, so I had to print it out, as the campus architect and assistant vice chancellor for physical and environmental planning at the University of California, Berkeley. Whew, all right. So to test them. So her portfolio includes planning, sustainability, and then really trying to keep the campus long-range plan intact. I'm really honored to have you here. You're FAIA, which is the highest honor of the American Institute of Architects. Recently, an emeritus of the AIA, right? So congratulations on that. Bill Glass, also FAIA, principal of Glass Associates. Your practice is really foundation of doing higher education buildings, and I've done several of them, hundreds, 100, somewhere in there. Yeah, that's a pretty good career. So, and you also have been a strong proponent of the AIAEB and started the UC AIAEB joint lecture series. Is that correct? That's right. So thank you for that. As a part of the motivation for starting this, we should have our own lecture series here. So hopefully we can, keep building this as much as you've built that in the last 20 years. Janet Tam, your firm, Nolan Tam, is really interesting to us, and you were kind of interesting because we didn't know where to put you. You just do so many different types of projects in this sector and others in the public sector, and so I think the higher education is going to be great. I'd love to hear your perspective on it and really have that conversation and bring in your knowledge from lots of different projects. And so right now you're the current CEO and founding partner of Nolan Tam. Gary Strang, we've known each other for a long period of time. I worked next to you in an office when I first moved here, whatever year that was. Then I transferred to a new firm and worked in your office. So that's been fun. So you've really been inspiring as far as your creativity, your kindness, your intellect. And then I think you've been exciting to most architects because you are an architect and a landscape architect, and being able to bring architecture into landscape into architecture, and be able to be nimble in that, along with all your other qualities, has been really wonderful. So
you didn't work for me.
I did not work for you. I worked in a corner of your office for Kennelly Architecture.
Kennelly Architecture was incubated in our
Yes, thank you for the clarifications. Great. And then, okay, so tonight's moderator is Renee Chow. She's the principal of Studio Urbis and the William W. Worcester Dean and UC Berkeley people, and a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of California. So I'm gonna hand it over to you guys, to you, Renee, to guide us in the right direction, and hopefully it's a wonderful night. I have a thank you gift for all of you. So these are mugs. It's really fun because you drink and you can see yourself. People take them away if you guys don't do well. I have some extra waters for people, you know. And yeah, everyone, please welcome our panelists and.
So it's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. Hi, everybody, if I don't know you. And thank you to the panelists for joining us tonight. So I gave them a prompt to start with, 2 prompts. One is, how did you get involved in higher education? And then the second one was actually a multiple choice question, because as a teacher, you always, want to give potential ways that they can find their way through. So the second is, what are the criteria you use to assess if a higher education project is good or successful? And/or what is the future for higher education facilities? And they all have 3 to 5 minutes. I might give you a hand wave if you're getting around the 4-minute mark. And then we're going to open it up for questions. Emily.
Okay, I'm first and I don't have slides. So this is really going to be a test. Can you think outside the box? That is, listen to someone talk without looking at the slides. So the first thing is, many people don't know about campus architects, and maybe the 2 elephants in the room. One is, how do you get work on a campus? And 2 is, how do you go to work for the campus? So I thought I'd do a quick bio of how I ended up in that position, because often people ask me about it. So first I'll say that I have worked with all 3 of these architects in their firms, and I even worked for Bill before I went to work on campus back in the early years of my career. And so in the years before and after I was licensed, I worked more or less conventionally in design practices. And when I was at Berkeley, I had been a stellar student, but I never felt that the firms were fit for what I was interested in doing. And also I had 3 children, and the lack of stability in the profession, as some of you may know, plus the poor to non-existent benefits. And at the time when I started, the typical under the table compensation, not in Bill's office, I would like to say, was a huge personal problem for me. But in the mid 1980s, I had terrific experience working for Richard Bender, who was then Dean of the College of Environmental Design. And I was coordinator of something called the Campus Planning Study Group. And this was work for the Berkeley campus, and I supervised graduate students, and I worked closely with a few architects, Donlin Linden, John Woodbridge, and others, along with Richard. And it brought together many of my own personal interests and skills, and it was very meaningful. And I discovered I had a special feel for campuses. I like the politics, I like the people, I like being around. I just like being in that environment. And so for 2 years, I was also an adjunct professor. I taught 4 graduate and undergraduate studios, and I kind of liked the puzzle of being at an institution, and the fact that there was a lot going on out there, in addition to the teaching and learning that are so familiar to us from having gone to colleges. I also spent a few years in Washington, D.C., and I worked for a landscape and planning firm. There was no higher education work there, but I did planning, programming, historic preservation, and design guideline projects for NIH, for the Navy, for the Army, for the Air Force, and also for some municipal governments. When I came back to California, I worked a few more years at firms, and I did some consulting on my own, but eventually Sam Davis, some of you know Sam Davis, Sam, who was then chair of the architecture department, offered me a job as the department office manager. And here's what he told me. He said, there's opportunities here at Berkeley. You'll have to find them, but to find them, you'll have to be here. So this is really an important thing, and it's relevant to getting work, any kind of work on a campus, is that taking that job was a risk. And remember, I've been a superstar student and an adjunct faculty member, and there's more than a little humiliation involved in going back to work in an administrative staff job in the same department where I had done other kinds of work. But just as Sam hoped, I discovered there was more to Berkeley and more to being an architect in higher education than teaching and learning. And so I moved on from the Department of Architecture to campus-wide jobs and much broader understanding of institutional higher education. I became active in SCUP. I was the chair of the National AIA's Public Architects Advisory Group. I'm a member of something called the Association of University Architects. And in fact, there's about 125 university campus and campus architects in the United States and Canada. And it's, it's a profession in which you are a professional client, an owner's representative, but a professional client working with the architects who come on board to do projects in higher education. So it's kind of a specialized career, but it's very exciting. You get to work with really interesting people and you get to be in a very interesting setting. So then I did make some notes about what I think, do I have time still, Renee? What I think is, what makes,
You're at 4, but you can have more.
okay, what makes this,
Going. So
I'll see two of my.
I get some point, I get a couple of seconds because I don't have any slides. So, you asked what makes a successful project, and I wanted to say a couple of things that I think are kind of critical, and that is, if you're working in higher education, you have to be able to balance, to hold in your two hands 3 very different kinds of timelines, and to be successful in them. For example, the first timeline, the immediate thing that you're thinking about the work, well, you have to get along with people. You have to be able to understand that universities are places where decision-making, influence, authority is all very opaque. And also where you're being evaluated for your projects being on time and on budget by some people, but not by others. So the whole experience of designing and constructing a building is one place in which your success is being measured, in which people are evaluating whether or not you're a good architect or a good fit. Then there's a medium timeline, and that is, did the project you design, is it successful for the people that are in it? Did you achieve the goals, the program goals? Do people go to work there or do their research there, or is that successful? That's the kind of thing we talk about post-occupancy evaluation stuff. But then, and this is the thing that I really like best talking about, there's a part of success that has to do with the long time horizon of universities. They really are about more than the immediate building of the building, the immediate users of the building. Universities, I think, even in the future, and campuses are creating places that have to do with what's going to happen 50 years and 100 years from now. And if you can't hold on to that, as well as with all the other ambiguity of who's telling you what to do and who has the real power and where does the money come from, it's very hard to be successful on the campus. And in that context, I really think that landscape architects have much to teach us, because the idea about the growth of plants and how you have to think about them in the long term is really also something you have to think about when you're designing a campus building or creating a campus landscape or thinking about a campus program or working on a master plan, because you have to be able to think both, in the present and in the future. And that's how I would measure success.
thank you, Emily. Bill, I think you have slides, so you might.
Yeah. I'm going to limit what I'm going to say. I'm going to go back to Emily's first elephant in the room. Honestly now, how many of you are here tonight, or I can't see if you're online, but how many of you are here to learn something about how to get work in your offices for higher education clients? Hands? 1, 2, couple. So my experience in higher education projects is all with the University of California. It's in the 3 Northern California campuses, and I can offer a lot of information about the process of getting a project there, what the different delivery systems are, what happens when you get a project and how it runs. And I've got a lot of stories and anecdotes. And for those of you who are interested, when we get around to questions and answers, ask those questions and I will proceed with whatever answers or stories I can offer up to sort of help you. I don't want to talk about how many decades I've been doing this, but I started in architecture between my junior and senior year of high school. I worked all the way through my years at Berkeley. I worked all the way through my years in graduate school. And I graduated Berkeley a quarter early. I went back to Cambridge. I got a job with Hugh Stubbins and Associates. And in those days in Cambridge, there were 4 offices all doing work that looked almost exactly the same. And that's because the architects who are working for those firms move from firm to firm. So some worked for Hugh, some worked for Rolf Landsberg, some worked for TAC, the firm that doesn't exist anymore, the Architects Collaborative, and others. And they would just move around those offices and the work all looked the same. But so much of that work in all of those offices was educational and university and college work. And so that's where I first was introduced to the subject, and it's stayed with us. It's been the heart of our practice. We do other kinds of projects, but the heart of our practice has been educational work, and the heart of the heart has been our work at the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute here at Berkeley. Gary participated in that work as well with us. So I'll pass at this point and
Thank you, Bill. Janet.
Hi everyone, I'm Janet Tam. Let me just see there I am. I think it's actually a hard question, like how did you start to go way back in your memory and try to remember why you do what you do or why you are where you are. But is it on? But I think you're right, Brian. I was sort of surprised when you asked me to do higher ed. I don't know, we were specialists in higher ed because we do consider ourselves, thank you, public architects. 99.9% of our work is in the public sector. And now when we think about our work, we think of ourselves as community architects because a lot of our work is for communities and the collective experience. And I actually think of higher ed as in that same category of work where you are thinking, I mean, it's a campus, it's a system, and it's an amazing community of people. And so so for us, it's, doing higher ed is working in the realm of the collective social experience. And our motto is uncommon spaces for the common good, which does apply to all of our work. And I just want to mention here that, when I think of higher ed, there really are commonalities between all the institutions, but there are also a lot of differences. And I guess we'll get into it later, like we're doing some work at private universities like Stanford, also public, not just UC systems, but also CSU, California State Universities, and also doing more and more work now with community colleges. This really is, again, almost more community oriented and student focused than many of our other higher ed projects. But I think Chris Knoll and myself actually started at UC Berkeley at Worcester Hall.
We're now Barrow Worcester.
Oh, you're Barrow. Oh my gosh, thank you for correcting me. All right. That's fair. Yeah, that's all right. About time. But but we started together and then we went off and did our own things, worked for large firms in San Francisco, which were design oriented and focused also on public work. And so I think with that sort of background, this seemed like a really good segue. And our very first project as a kind of two-person firm, sort of in our own little new office, finally is on our own and not working for other firms, was the art history library. You were there then, and it was working for Beth. Actually, actually was working for Bill Toller. And one of the first questions in the interview was, what's your record with the campus fire marshal? Can you get us to the fire marshal? It's kind of the thing that was most important on his mind. But 30 years later, we're turning 30 now. We've worked on, we counted at least 70 different kinds of projects on the UC Berkeley campus. Some are very small, some are studies, some are, I'll show you in a sec. I mean, we feel very proud. One of our proudest moments is being asked to do the Campanile handrails. I don't know if you noticed when you go up the Campanile, those were not original, and we do those. It's one on that side. And then we've done a lot of people. We in our office, people have been there a long time. Say, well, we are redoing UC Berkeley one space at a time, and so we've worked on the Bechtel Engineering Library. We do a lot of libraries, and this was one of them also. And we also worked in the Student Community Center on campus. Are all renovations, but our largest project, which was in association with Ratcliffe, is the UC Bancroft Library renovation. And that was something that had also in its own, I have to call it community process, but really committee process, which, really is part of the wealth of information and just sort of interaction you have on an amazing project on campus. And all of our projects on campus have been renovations. And then I think some of the most interesting projects are with the department that Emily has run, the PAP, used for planning. And there are a lot of studies that happen on campus that maybe for many of you, you may be interested in those. It's really, in my mind, the start. It's the nugget of the strategic planning for a particular department, and involves a lot of sort of strategic thinking. And those have been a wealth of I don't know, information and understanding of how the campus is really run. It gets you understanding the system wide as opposed to a single little project. And the last question, which is that you asked, was, what do you see the future of working on campus? And there's a lot that has sort of maintained and sort of processed. A lot has changed, but I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that universities, no matter where you are, all really marketing for CAP faculty and marketing for students, or using, or there, it's really donor based. A lot of it is this sort of financial model of that it has to keep the university running, and how do our spaces support that to attract researchers or to make sure students who come have the best experience. And a lot of the issues nowadays, maybe you guys share this, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion focus is really very strong, especially on campuses where, what is the student experience, and are you making it a welcoming environment, and how can we do that through our design? And it affects, a lot of, especially at universities and community colleges where you have first generation students. How do you evolve your thinking so that our design is a very welcoming and safe place? So, and there's more, but that's all I have to say right now.
Gary.
Okay, let's see. All right, I am the principal of a 10-person firm in San Francisco consisting of landscape architects and architects working under one roof, all focused on the design of urban landscapes. And the ambiguity of what we do is reflected in our logo, as you can see there. How we came to this is that I studied environmental planning and management at UC Davis before studying architecture at UC Berkeley. Dan Solomon was one of my professors, and I ended up working for him for 7 years. Dan was involved in architecture and urban design, so he always had a multidisciplinary bent, which he's continued to this day with Methuen. And this is one of the projects that resulted from those 7 years of collaboration. He hired me to bring landscape architecture capabilities to his office to add to his multidisciplinary plan in exchange for training me to be an architect. And so this kind of professional fluidity or ambiguity has caused us to show up on projects that don't easily classify as either a building or a landscape, such as the 2 acres of waterfront outdoor space at the Exploratorium. It's all peer work. This 2 acres of outdoor space on top of operating rooms and a parking garage at the new Stanford Hospital, or this switch station, electrical switch station, which we designed at UC Berkeley, which serves the new stadium and actually goes full story down under the ground. And we like to think of it as the largest junction box on campus. We also, like Janet, have done many, many projects at UC Berkeley over the years, from patching up infrastructure repairs to some very ambitious design projects. And the way that we came to that is that 2 classmates of mine from architecture school at UC Berkeley ended up working at EHDD. EHDD has a long record of doing higher ed work, and Chuck Davis, they invited me to give a lecture at their office. Chuck Davis invited me to participate in a project at UC Santa Cruz that really had a lot of schedule and money issues, and we kind of pulled a rabbit out of a hat for him, and then he invited us to do the exact same thing here at UC Berkeley at units 1 and 2 on a project that involved the addition of 900 beds on 2 city blocks. The charge that EHDD had was to add 2 new dormitories in this pinwheel arrangement of buildings designed by John Carl Warnicki, which they did. So they added 4 new residence halls. And our charge was to replace these concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass dining pavilions, which were seismically very unsafe, with a new courtyard that was designed originally by Lawrence Halprin. It was very beautiful and made a wonderful 1-story world against these 10-story towers. And so now that those residence halls look like this, and much of this landscape is on top of structure. There's a basement below the landscape that has student services. So we did this on 2 sites, and at a time when we probably weren't totally qualified to do that. But I think because I was coming from an architecture office, we were maybe the best thing going for Chuck Davis at the time, and he opened a lot of doors for us. This is in the historic core of campus, the renovation of Durant Hall with Mark Cavagnero, which required removing a half-story of soil to create a new accessible entry to the basement elevator, which would then make the basement and the attic available, and it basically gave new life to this old building, which was not very well used at the time. At the Hospital of Business, we worked with Kathy Simon when she was at Perkins and Will on the addition of a new academic building for the business school, when business schools across the US were expanding. And our main task was to redesign this courtyard, designed by Charles Moore. This was his last project. And the idea was that the Hospital of Business was a kinder, gentler, ethics-driven business school, and it had a residential feel and lots of small, intimate outdoor spaces. And what we were asked to do was to create open plan outdoor space, flexible outdoor space, which was equivalent to the kind of interior open space that they were looking for. And so we raised the planting up off the ground plane in order to accommodate lots of different activities of all different scales. And as the dean of the business school was quoted as saying, that the redesign of the courtyard completely transformed the social life of the school. So that's one of our criteria for success. And for fun, I just wanted to show the unbuilt Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive by Toyo Ito, which we worked on with him for about a year. And EHD was the architect of record. And this project was scuttled by the recession of about 2010. But the building was conceptualized as expressing where the grid of the city of Berkeley meets the pastoral landscape of the campus. And that would be achieved by peeling apart these Richard Serra-like modules, which were made out of 1-inch thick steel and were thought to be built at a shipyard like Richard Serra's work. And this is the way that it was coming together before the project died. And there was a base isolation system. We worked on the landscape, which would move with the building in the event of an earthquake. Probably one of the reasons why this building went from becoming like a world-class icon to a renovation project that was executed by Diller Scofidio. So in terms of how we would judge success, I would say if the project rejuvenates a building, takes something that's not useful and makes it useful, if it improves the relationship, if it supports a long-term master planning goal, I think that's a success rather than, say, resolving a difficult relationship or mitigating a difficult relationship, like really improving it. And then secondly, does it make safe spaces for community to develop, which I really think is kind of the crisis of our time with students. And part of that is, I think, bringing people closer to nature. And then finally, I just want to say to the question of what is the future, I would say I see a future for higher ed work where buildings and landscapes are in a much more equal dialogue, and maybe even where landscape concerns are driving the form of buildings, and that circulation, spaces in between, environmental concerns will become much more front and center. So thank you.
So we have made a guess. So I have some preset questions that it would be about how one gets involved in this kind of work, but you didn't raise your hands for that, and I will let you know that we have a moderator for whoever's online as well. We're co-moderating. So I was just curious, amongst those of you who decided to come for this session, what it was that you were curious about. Why did you choose higher education as the topic to join? Anybody? They're smiling. Yeah, please.
Actually, I'm a civil engineer listening in to the architects that I have the pleasure of working with. And I've also spent my entire career on higher education. And one of the things that I've really been interested in is, from both a landscape and an architectural standpoint, what are the impacts that COVID has had on your thinking about designing the buildings and designing the outdoor spaces? Because I know that it impacted the entire world. And I know campus life was turned upside down during the COVID, and hopefully we're past it forever. But I assume that there have been, and I've seen changes. I'd like to get your insight on how it has changed it, and I assume for the better.
I'll just make a quick reply to that. I think basically, as a result of COVID, everything that you can do inside a building, there's a desire to do that outside the building. So, and we have seen that at Berkeley. We did it with Bill at the Math Sciences Research Institute, outdoor classrooms, outdoor chalkboards, outdoor whiteboards, heaters. I think there are economic reasons to do it. It's more affordable space to create, and also can be more enjoyable and maybe healthier.
Emily.
Well, even though Brian said that I retired in 2018, I actually spent the last several years working on the project that's now under construction on the Berkeley campus, the new gateway building for the new College of Computing and Data Science and Society. Get the name right.
CDSS.
CDSS. Did I forget one of the S's? And one of the things I think is very interesting is that that project was designed by a terrific firm from New York, Weissman Frady, through the pandemic. That's when it was being designed. That's when the meetings were. That's when the concepts were being created. So there was a lot of discussion about the change and the opportunities and the kinds of things that Gary was talking about. But I would be almost willing to bet money that when we see that building completed, it's not going to look any different from another building that would have been completed before COVID. I mean, Renee, you've seen the drawings and yeah, I really, there was a lot of discussion, but in the end, especially because as we know, as we're all here, no one's wearing one mask here, but we're not wearing masks. COVID's kind of wound down. So, back to business as usual. So I think that the changes, actually, Renee, you might be more able to talk about it. How is it in the sort of feeling of being on the campus, the feeling of the students, the character of being on a campus might feel different, but the building that building itself at hundreds of millions of dollars does not look different than a building you would have seen designed before COVID.
Unfortunately.
Do you agree? I mean, you've seen it.
Janet?
I can't speak exactly to higher ed, but I do know our public clients are concerned about their mechanical systems and making sure that windows are operable, and also this indoor-outdoor space. I think if you're doing a renovation, it's more challenging because you can't always knock out all walls to create open space to expand into it. But if you're designing new buildings, that's what we're doing. We are making walls that move so that you can expand your function to the outside if you can, including outdoor classrooms. But I do think there were projects we had that were in design during COVID, and there was a big flurry of should we do something different, and in the end there wasn't that much that was done differently, because a lot of the things like putting up screens or spacing out, it seemed like a moment of more panic, and then as things sort of settled out, I don't know if I don't know if it's not exactly business as usual, but it's not as drastic as it was at the very beginning of COVID when people just were afraid.
I would offer up that I don't think we know where we're going yet. It's all too fresh. We just got through gonna actually do a final punch list walk on a modest sized project at UCSC for something called Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. And I had a session with the two drivers of the project for that group about lecture halls. None of the spaces that we did the TIs for this project were lecture halls, but we had a meeting to discuss that. And the lead of that organization was asked by the campus to look into the program issues around the work that's being done at Kresge College down there. Kresge, for those of you who know the history, was an MLTW project, highly acclaimed in the architectural profession. It has suffered terribly because of poor construction and poor detailing. But Studio Gang is doing an enormous addition to that campus that includes academic buildings and includes more housing. And it'll be interesting to see where the public spaces end up. At the end of it, the original Kresge was designed as sort of an Italian street, but paved in tarmac rather than brick. But when asked about the program, about the lecture spaces, the particular question that this person was asked was, how do you see lecture halls being shaped in the future for, large lectures of 500 people, so forth, as we all have been in lecture halls of that size. And the response was, in the future, there's not going to be a 500-person lecture. There's going to be a combination of smaller lectures, smaller communication, exchange of information, exchange of knowledge that'll be some personal and a lot virtual or a lot online. So I would say that, when we look at what academic spaces are going to be like for buildings that we're just starting to design now, that might be completed in 5 years, and that's about the time frame of a university project. If you're just beginning to get underway at a project, and for those firms that have never done a university project, don't expect it to happen quickly. I think all of the members of the panel will tell you, and don't expect to make any money on it because the fees are legislated, the ceiling of the fees is legislatively mandated. There's usually very little discussion about the fees once you get selected to do a project. You will be lucky if you can max out the available fees and get the job done without losing money. So, and it takes a long time. The projects drag out. You get all the way through the project and you think you're ready to go. And the Division of the State Architect says, no, you can't do it that way. You got to do something else. So just be aware that it's a different world.
We campus administrators, thank you. And that's a nonprofit. Another question is, how come you came to this?
Maybe, maybe I need to that one. I think if we think as designers, those landscape architecture architects, like having the possibility to work with a different time frame, like a time scale which is different for that typology, what our project is, I think that's something amazing. I mean, the design process doesn't happen quickly. I totally get that point, but then the other side of that point is that you have the project is going to be designed for be there for 100 years, right? And I think that's very unique from like higher education project, right?
That,
So that's the master plan vision.
that's the goal. I think you might expect that the shell of the building is going to be there for 100 years. You must also expect that if you go back to the building you designed in 15 years, somebody else is going to have renovated it for some other use or for some change that, you know, the pedagogy is driven. And, you know, my local son, I have two sons, one is in Southern California, and one is here. My local son and I, believe it or not, still have Cal season football tickets. And at every home game, we walk through Gary's space at the business school to get to the stadium. And it's a wonderful transition that, you know, that they've accomplished there. It is quite different than it was, you know, the first years we started walking through the business school to get to the stadium. And those kinds of spaces are, you know, are going to be just as important as anything in that building that's going to last 100 years.
I just also wanted to respond to sort of your sort of direction of how long these things take. And I think what is kind of amazing about most university or higher ed projects is that there's always a larger master plan that, I don't know, Emily can speak to them, where that is like, maybe it's done at least 10 years earlier before a project really trickles down to become an actual project. And that, so by the time you get to it, there's been a lot of thinking, and whether it's even still up to date, you still have to confirm all that stuff, or whether the budget's still the same. But it for the University of California, it goes all the way to the regions first, right? And then what's the whole process? And then,
Well, it's a very long process.
so you know, a lot changes, and it's kind of an interesting question. How do you make a project current when was planned already, you know, so many years ahead? And then the process itself has its own sort of rigor. And I think even a small project, it would be surprising if it ever got from design through construction in less than, you know, 8 months, if it's just a TI, or most likely for like the Bancroft Library project went on for several years before it was really completed. Sorry.
Well, I'd like to reiterate what I said about being able to hold in two hands 3 different timelines. Because it is really, I mean, what you said is exactly right. That's the great pleasure of the long horizon of being around a university. It's just, if you think about the expansion of knowledge and what the kind of overall mission of the university, it's a very powerful idea. So you want to be able to somehow hold on to that while you're going through whatever the lengthy process is of the immediate designing and getting your building under construction, which I personally think sometimes universities have a bad rep about the time. And when I said that there was a sort of opacity around the decision-making, I think it's more that big institutions have complex decision-making, and it's hard for the people that are doing the work to understand the steps that are required by a university, the different kinds of approval. It's not just the fire marshal, but then there's, you know, the fire marshal is easy to make fun of, like you said, that, and it's easy to make, you know, to sort of think that there are too many committees. But when you're thinking about the horizon of a university, it's not actually that long, and each piece of it, when it's functioning, works, I think, relatively smoothly. Now, I have to give my thing, which is the real reason I think it doesn't go quickly. Usually has to do with the funding of projects. The money doesn't flow smoothly. So unless you don't have a, you know, it's not like you have a bank account all of a sudden and then you can get the project going. And I would say that in general, those are the things that hold up the projects and that hold up the approvals. And in a public university, you can't do one step without the money for the next step. And, you know, there's a lot of legal and regulatory requirements. And if there's not legal and regulatory requirements, then there's the whim of the donor. And that has its all other kind of thing about making something take a long time or not take a long time. Yes. Well, we have certainly whims of donors at Berkeley as well.
Right.
And that has quite a bit to do with the selection of architects if we get to that, and problematic.
And a private university like Stanford has,
Pardon?
a private university like Stanford for sure has, in some ways, a whole lot more flexibility. There's still funding issues of it. So much as over the years have been, even before the public universities has been privately funded. And so you're always, a donor can be in charge of who the architect is. They may have a favorite architect that the university feels obligated to select. So it is a different process for private universities.
Follow up on that a little bit, because we're sitting in the shadow of Berkeley and all of you share this with me, this common thread with UC Berkeley. What do you find is similar across higher education projects and what's different? We had a conversation prior, community colleges, private versus public. What's similar and what's different in that kind of work?
Well, I think one of the things that's similar is that, and this ties into this previous conversation, I mean, the landscape framework, does actually persist as buildings come and go. So if there is a strong landscape framework, I think that can be very helpful. And I think it's helpful to come to the university with a master planning mindset, so that whatever it is you're assigned to work on, that you're automatically trying to anticipate what's going to happen next. It's like a chessboard. I'm going to move here. They're going to have to move here. Then what happens? And that long-term horizon of the university, I think, is in some ways more important for having a landscape framework than the architecture. There's also no property lines, as we discussed a little bit previously. So when you come to your site, where does your project end? I mean, I don't think our projects ever ended up with the same scope of work as they started with, as you discover, complications of working, with 100 years of infrastructure. And I think one of the challenges of Berkeley and maybe California institutions is that they all probably suffered from suburban sprawl, as so many universities did in the post-war years, so that schools that have a core like Stanford or an East Coast campus are, at least they have something to kind of hold the campus together or to refer to. But I think it's been really hard to reclaim a structure at Berkeley. It's been kind of piecemeal, is my perception of it. And that the framework for the future that I think is in the LRDP described is that Strawberry Creek is a structure that maintains while all the various Beaux-Arts plans have been modified and altered and changed, from one era to another.
And we have a history at Berkeley of some wonderful old buildings and some not so wonderful newer buildings. And I think that, the seismic risk assessment of all of the buildings at all the university campuses is doing Berkeley a big favor, because some of the buildings, one in particular right by Hearst Mining Circle, need to come down. It's just a toad amongst swans, and it's just
That's happening, right?
yeah, that's going to happen. And one of the things in my bio that you might have seen online was that I was on the campus design review committee for 7.5 years. And when I cycled off, actually Gary Brown and I cycled off at the same time, we had a luncheon with the chancellor, and he asked those of us who were cycling off, what do you see as the most important thing that can happen on campus? And my response was that, during your tenure, to the chancellor, during your tenure, the best thing you could do would be to take down Evans Hall. And so, it's now finally, I think, getting there, yes. But I would defer to the others now.
I'm not working there anymore, but I worked on plenty of projects to take that building down.
Yeah.
Studies, how many, that's the thing, is there are many studies to do a lot of work. And that's the part that Janet, as Janet said, there's a lot of stuff that happens before there's a actual implementation of an action. So if you're not comfortable with that kind of time frame, you don't want to work on a campus.
Janet, can you reflect on community?
Yeah.
versus public versus private?
Yeah, as best I can. I mean, our experience is that, I mean, there are differences, there are different cultures. Community colleges have historically been a little bit more like the extension of K through 12. And in fact, many of you probably already know this, if you've done K through 12 or community colleges, the approval process is quite different. Higher ed universities and community colleges all have accessibility review for DSA, Department of State Architecture, but community colleges go through the full DSA approval process, which includes MEP structural and it's the full delivery process. Whereas Berkeley and Stanford are sort of they don't have to comply to it. And community colleges, when they hire architects, typically they have a pool. There's an RFP that goes out and, okay, who wants to be in this pool? And so you throw your hat in the ring. And if you get into a pool of, it could be as many as 20 people, could be as few as 5. And from that pool, they usually select architects for many of their projects. If they're major projects, then they will have a public approval process. All the public and institutions, all the UC systems and CSU, and also community colleges all have a public RFP process. So you must compete for these projects. Whereas Stanford, they can do whatever they want. It's a private process in terms of selection. I think there's also a delivery process that's different, and the governing processes are different. Like for community colleges, a lot of community colleges are doing design build because it's within their procurement ability. I think UC Berkeley doesn't do design build, or typically they don't.
They do design build.
Okay, I thought they did
They
not
do design
see
build.
at risk.
That's happening right now, but they've done design build in the past. I worked on any number
you did?
of
Okay.
design build projects.
Okay.
Some of them are terrible. You know, the building I have to do the little gossip, that building on the corner of Hurst and Oxford on the northwest corner, that was a design build building.
Yeah, anyway, I think one commonality, more and more of these institutions are starting to try to move away from the low bid, but there's still low bid exists in all of them, depending on the scale. I think, also there's this, well, I don't know, maybe just I think community colleges are different, and then it feels to me like there is a very robust student sort of engagement process. I think it's not that the UC systems don't have it, but sometimes for me, it feels like it depends on the scale of the project, and it also depends on whether it's student funded or not. So those are some of the differences I see.
Does it have something to do with how much oversight the different higher ed systems offer? Like, UC Berkeley has a lot of really highly qualified people who kind of guide development. When you go to a community college or state college, they really don't have, as deep of a bench and as much resources to throw at the management of projects.
They hire construction management firms to run the construction process usually.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about being part of this organization, the Association of University Architects, is that you get to meet architects at many different types of colleges and universities throughout the United States. And, California is a very big market for architecture, but it's true that in other places, and even some of the Cal states sometimes end up with a particularly robust design and construction group internally for whatever reason. And certainly some of the state colleges and other places have a kind of a deep bench. And then also many of them are doing exactly what you said. They're hiring outside construction firms. I think the person that used to be the campus architect at one of the Cal states and then was the overall university architect for the University of California, she is now managing a multi-$100-million design program for a big AE firm for community colleges in Southern California. So, on the owner side. So, I think it's a mixed bag. And I think what you said about student participation is very interesting. That's probably true.
And since a lot of universities and colleges are such an important asset to the creative community, can you share some tools or processes that can be actively engage the community, whether that be students, faculty, or greater community members that are stakeholders in that project? And how that compares and how supporting goals with diversity.
Can you repeat the question, Mike?
Yeah, I remembered we're supposed to do that now. So engagement with the community. I would also couch that in sort of a town gown. There are traditional town gown issues that emerge, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of how you feel that everyone participates in the development of a higher education facility.
I would talk just a little bit about the range of experience we've had at the university, as opposed to the colleges, state colleges and community colleges. There is this hierarchy of project structure. There is usually, for an academic project, some department or individual within the department driving the project. And the participation by faculty and students of that department varies fairly dramatically by who is driving the project. Some people are much more inclusive in that process, getting people engaged than others. And where the students are involved, it's for us has been something of a challenge to get them involved continuously on a project because of the same issue we talked about a little while ago, and that is these projects go on a long while. So a student may be really interested in this project, and 3 years later, when the project is finally getting to some sort of campus design review, students graduated, gone, or no longer interested, or frustrated by the project. So, or by the length of time it takes. So it's a difficult challenge, but each of the campuses, when they hire architects, when they go through the selection process, will want to know how you expect and how you plan to engage faculty and students and administrators in the project. And so there's a process that we've all come to accept as part of, getting a project that involves, consultants that specialize in, if you don't do it yourself, specialize in organizing student outreach and in, imagining what the project's going to, to present to somebody and look like. So it's all, some of it ends up happening and it really works well. Some of it, not so much.
Jen?
Okay. We're finding, it does vary in terms of the level of engagement. If you're doing, for example, a community project, there's no question you would have a community engagement process. It's how it's done. We have found that in our experience on campuses, if it's a student focused project, like we did a whole surge project years ago, where it was really funded by the students in their tuition, then it really involved, then already the stakeholders were clear. It was the student council, or the governing board, and they had brought people. And so it was a process that they sort of activated, and we presented to them. We met with them up at different points in the process to review our designs and to be sure we were satisfying everything and to understand really what their needs are. That was already sort of built in. But I think more and more campuses are trying to engage students in ways that they maybe haven't, whether they are the stakeholders or not. So what we do is before any project starts, if a owner university client is willing to have a process, because sometimes it lengthens a process, you have to have everybody on board to do it. And we advocate for it. And so if a client wants to, then it's great. But you identify who the stakeholders are. And for example, for the Bancroft Library, it was kind of a robust, sort of strong committee process that then extended into other departments. But so the stakeholders were faculty, they were department heads. We had students who were also assigned. And maybe it could have been broader, but you identify who's important to the project. And sometimes it expands beyond just the people who are users, but it may be because it's a campus, you may want to involve others. So the first thing is to identify who is going to affect the project and who will be affected by it. And then you set up a series of sort of, whether they're workshops or charrettes or, just to help to identify what the scope is or what's important, what's the vision. And then out of that, you can develop designs, but you wait until this sort of, I don't know, you can call it programming, you can call it community engagement, whatever you want to call it, but it's just pre-designed stuff that helps shape what is important about the project. And that's really important for an approach that includes inclusion, because you don't always know. And if you have students who are, or stakeholders who aren't used to having a voice, you need to draw them out, or you need to ask them the right questions, like, not leading questions, but just to understand what is important to them. And if you're working with first generation students, then what we found is it's really important that safety, feeling safe, or culturally what's important is really important to identify. And then how can you incorporate that into your design thinking? And not, I had an interesting conversation with Wendy the other day, and what was interesting, she was in the community process of students, and what was, maybe she's on the call, I don't know, but was interesting, a student came up and says, I have felt really intimidated by some of the spaces I go into, because they're so, that they weren't, they felt uncomfortable because it wasn't something that they experienced as a in their life. And so it's just being aware of the large population of students that these are, especially our public universities and community colleges have.
Well, I'd like to say two things about this, because, in my role, I was responsible for trying to make that happen. And so working with people like Janet was incredibly important, because some of the consultants are terrific at helping us understand how to include the conversations. But before we would have even hired a consultant, we were always trying to find students who were willing to participate. And I also would like, and because, as Bill said, students come, students go, they have exams, they can't keep to the schedule of a professional activity. And so you really have to figure out a way, as I think Janet's been quite successful at doing, at engaging the ideas of students, even if you're not getting ongoing information from a single student. It's like you're trying to incorporate the context of the student life. But I also would like to say that you said faculty and students, and I considered it one of my main educational activities to note that the campus is comprised, the people that are on the campus all the time are faculty, students, and administrative and other professional staff. So for example, when I was working there were about 2,000 faculty members, maybe a little fewer, and 5,000 to 6,000 staff members. And, the number of students would vary, say 25 to 35,000 people. So you can't ignore the people that are because they're the people that are going to these committees all the time. And they're the people that are sort of following up when the faculty members have a sabbatical or when the students have exams. And so you really have to understand that the campus and the outside community, it's a very complex group of stakeholders. And so what I feel like was most helpful with consultants like these was that they helped us figure out how to incorporate ideas from all these varied stakeholders that didn't actually act in a way that looked like it did on a flow chart. And I always found that extremely helpful. Some of the things that you did, Shannon.
And I think when you do this work, we talked about this in a pre-meeting that we had, you need to approach your relationship with the staff that are organizing and managing the projects for the university or the college with some amount of both modesty and honoring the work that they do. Because almost to a person, all of the people we've worked with at the 3 campuses are talented and dedicated. And, they're there to make these projects good. They're not there to make a buck. They're not there just because of the benefits that they get as university employees, but, they care about what they do. And they know more about what happens there than you do. So you got to listen to them. You have to really respect the work that they do. I would add, just on a completely different note, one thing that we found across the board is that students and faculty, not so much the staff that manages or runs the projects, but students and faculty are universally naive about what they're going to get for the dollars that are going to be spent on the project. So there's some amount of controlling expectations that you have to participate in. They're just unrealistic about what a dollar will buy. And I think also there's been a change over the years that we've been working in what you can do as a consultant for a direct hire project. The university can hire a consultant without going through a selection process up to a total fee of $100,000. Well, $100,000 in fees doesn't buy now what it bought 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And because that change to that limit has to be approved by the legislature, it's not going to change in the near future, because the legislature, doesn't want to get involved in, raising potential consultant fees from 100,000 to 200,000 or whatever a more logical number would be. So, once you've established a relationship with the campus and they need, a small renovation, and Janet's talked about, some of these small projects, we've done a lot of them. You get a call and say, we've got this, we need to have it. The faculty member is going to be here. It's a new hire. We need to have a modest change to this laboratory so that this faculty member, will be able to do what they do. Can you do it? And can we get it, done in, within a year? Those are getting fewer and further between, because the amount of work that goes into almost any project now, and trying to build a laboratory of any kind or do a renovation of a laboratory for under $1,000 a square foot is just almost impossible. So just advice.
Swing it to the other side, and I'm going to let Gary take first stab. On the town side, you talked a lot about community engagement, which is campus engagement. But how is it that, and I'll stick to Berkeley, how do I avoid a people's park? In other words, in which how do you engage the neighborhood and sort of public civic sense of the town that sits around the campus as campuses can grow, or projects are not in the center of the campus, but now they're on the edge and starting to expand into the periphery that sits between the town gown line?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, People's Park is, I'm not going to address. I have no idea. That is its own animal, and that goes back 40 years or so. And I grew up in the East Bay, so I grew up while the original People's Park debacle was transpiring. But we work close by, adjacent actually, on units 1 and 2. And the reason that we came on that project, the renovation project for the residence halls had completed schematic design, but the landscape, for whatever reason, had not. And it was kind of stuck with the design review committee and also with the neighborhood. I don't know if I'm telling the same story that you remember, Emily, but so
I love
correct
to
me.
hear stories from different points of view. That's how
Feel
you get the
free.
truth. That's how you get to the truth.
Yeah, so but the way that, so we were coming on very late in the game and we were asked to do a lot of work in a very short amount of time, and there's a huge open space in the middle. And so we made a strategic decision, forget about the middle, just show something that looks like a landscape. Let's just deal with the perimeter. Because
Why not?
if you can, and this goes back to what Bill was saying, like the people that you're dealing with at the university, if you can figure out what they're responsible for and what their interests are, and then focus on solving their problem for them. And in that case, I think it had a lot to do with diffusing neighborhood anxiety about these two large buildings that were about to be built. So we just focused on the streets, sidewalks, you know, the entries, the new staircases that were going to feed the site. I mean, basically the whole site was walled off, you know, by John Carl Warnicki, and there was only a couple of entrance points. And so even though we were adding all this mass of building, we were able to show that the site was going to be very permeable, and there were going to be stairs and ramps everywhere, and you could, the neighbors could cut through the site, and there'd be mid-block passages. And that very small amount of simple work, just showing street trees in a row and how people were going to get in and out, you know, got the project to move forward in a very quick manner and bought us some time to then focus on the hard parts in the middle. And in the end, that project got a something called the Berkeley Design
Yeah.
Advocates, you know,
It's
Citizens
good.
Award for design or something, which is
It's
like
lovely.
completely shocking, you know.
It's
um,
lovely.
But anyway, so I do think the offsite parcels, off-campus parcels are a very different thing, because you have the university, but you also have the city of Berkeley, and you know, have like fire marshals to deal with and different concerns, and then all the neighbors. So yeah, so you got to get into their heads and figure out how to.
You know, the relationship between the city of Berkeley as an entity and individual people who are stakeholders in their neighborhoods around university projects has varied over the years I've worked there. You know, that was a time of great hostility. Things kind of settle down, then they go up, and things settle down. And the campus is involved in lots and lots of partnership activities with both neighborhoods and with the city. And we had a joint downtown area plan that we did together. I went to multiple meetings, some of which I was well received, some of which people were so hostile to me. You know, I was, you know, kind of shocking. One time my father came because he was visiting, and, you know, he's like 90 years old. I thought he was going to have, you know, get up and punch somebody because, you know, it's just, you begin to understand that people have an attitude about the university as a single entity, as a bully. And so I think part of like what you did with that design is to show that really the university is not a single entity that's a bully. It's a complex organization in which there's many different ideas about, and that the university welcomes ideas. And so when we would have workshops and people would sit down with us, we often would have a better outcome. And the People's Park situation, I think, even though it's been stopped now, is a good example of something that, I mean, I worked on that for 20 years with Sam, as you probably know. And in fact, the interaction with many stakeholders about People's Park has changed over that time, and it's been much more shared interests, like identifying the shared interest of doing transitional or supportive housing for unhoused people. That's a kind of an idea that came into the People's Park development that hadn't been there before. So I guess I feel like part of the university's responsibility of people in positions like mine is to reach out to the community and help people understand that there are ways that they can engage with us, and that the university really was willing to have kind of an open mind. You know, that's my 2 cents.
Sam is confident that eventually it's going to happen. So,
Yes.
So you and universities engaged in students and faculty on campus, the neighborhood. Then how do we find these future offices that attract, kind of help you maybe shape the goal of the long-range development plan that guides the school program?
Well, you know, a lot of it has to do with an individual, you know, the university, for example, for the long range development plan, they put out notices, there's signage, there's email, there's social media. And, you know, you can really only engage with people that come. And I think that's one of the challenges is how do you encourage more people to be more engaged? I don't think it's a lack of effort. You know, I think that really the people who are most hostile, for example, maybe are most talkative. Or, as I said to Brian, someone like me that grew up in South Philadelphia, I'm very talkative. But you know, maybe some other people aren't so talkative. It's hard to, how do you do that? But I think it's really important to know that whatever the university is, whatever that means for people, that the individuals that are working there are very eager to hear from stakeholders.
We've been involved in town and gown issues more in Santa Cruz than here. But they exist to some degree. Not quite the same level of passion as in Berkeley. But almost any of the campuses and all of the university campuses have expanded well beyond their original size and plans. A good number of the largest issues of conflict have to do with housing. And, you know, if the campuses continue to grow, there's more students, there's less housing available, the housing costs go up for everybody. And so it's a driver. And so that is part of it. But what we found was that in the consideration of any of these projects where the campus is expanding, where citizens of the community become involved, and you have the kinds of meetings that Emily talked about being advertised, sometimes they occur at city council meetings and so forth. It's imperative that when you go in and you make your presentation, you then listen to what people in the community are saying, because you'll be back and you'll be making another presentation. And then you'll be back maybe a third time or a fourth time and making more presentations. And if those community members feel that you have honestly listened to them and tried to incorporate their concerns into what you're doing, you'll find that there's potential for some level of cooperation. But you have to listen and you have to respond. You can't just drive on, you know, with what you thought you were going to do before you had your first meeting.
I don't, tell us something that you learned over the course of your careers, that you wish you knew.
So the question was, in your career, you said it well better than I can repeat.
What do you learn over your careers at the time for higher ed that you wish you started that?
So what do you wish you knew now that you learned over your career?
Well, for many, many years, we were working very closely with a couple of people at UC, the campus architect, and there were two campus landscape architects, and they pre-qualified us and a few others to do work there, and we got repeat work, and we didn't have to struggle that much for it. We did not count on such extreme regime change. And we found ourselves, you know, when people retired or moved on or whatever, that we had no connections left, you know, at the university. And I think that if we had it to do all over again, we would probably have been more inquisitive about, you know, what kinds of movements were afoot in the university and tried to make some alliances and stay involved in the community of UC.
It's really a good answer. I like that. Okay, borrow yours. I mean, because we've gone through that too. There are sort of, as you get, I don't know, there is a time frame, and then you need to sort of have succession planning and make sure people are staying connected. But I'm just trying to think. One of my earliest lessons is, and maybe we carry that, it's not so much that I would go back and change, but from that very first art history museum, art history slide library project, we learned that you must be right on the cost estimate from the very beginning, and you can't promise more than you can do. You really have to be really careful. And that very first project, we came in over budget at the bid, and it shook us up so much that we never forgot that you need to adjust expectations. You can't overpromise. You need to know that whatever you're drawing, that it's going to come in on budget at the bid. And it was a really important lesson. That first project was very painful. We managed to get through it, but maybe that's a lesson we did learn that we carried through.
I guess the lesson that applies to our higher ed projects is the same one that applies to our non-educational projects, which we learned fairly early on, and which is not as much of a problem now as it used to be, because drawings, the ability to do 3D representations in a variety of forms now, other than just the chipboard model or the basswood model or whatever that we might have thought of years ago, or sketches. The lesson is that despite how close the people that you're dealing with are to the program, a good number of them do not know what they're looking at when they look at a drawing. They do not conceive of space. They do not conceive of 3 dimensions in the same way that you do as an architect. We're trained in that. We think in that fashion. And so finding a way to communicate what the environment that you're trying to help this person get to is going to be like, going to look like, and going to feel like for them is something that you got to get to relatively soon. You have to understand just how much they get when they look at a drawing, or when they look at a model, or when they look at a 3D drawing. We had one client that we were sure was just going to be a problem in that regard. And she was a researcher at Berkeley, professor and researcher in chemistry that worked with 3D models. And so the simplest drawing was something she could grasp right away, and was sort of like, well, that's a relief, but for the most part, you're not going to get that.
That's true. Explaining drawings to people was a major activity that I did. It's really true. I have a different career path, so I can't maybe answer. The only thing I usually say to people is I wish that I had known earlier in my career that there were alternative ways to practice architecture that were not in a firm. I wish I had understood that. That's why I'm a little bit of a, proselytizer for looking at positions like mine in the various places where they exist. So
Just so you know, there is a regime change. The campus starting July 1st is heading at 13.5% to the philanthropic allocation that we do. Being deferred maintenance on campus, which means that there's going to be a lot more renovation work showing up for the next few years. So we're looking for work and getting to know the campus architect and the processes, start looking for that structure.
And if you're not in a big firm, if you're in a smaller firm or a medium-sized firm and you haven't done this work, that's the best way to get in the door, because the major projects, start at 50 million and go up to hundreds of millions of dollars. And, only the Smith groups of the world are going to get those projects. It's, you're as a small firm in Berkeley or Oakland or even in San Francisco, you're not going to be considered for that kind of work unless you team with a firm that is a much larger firm, or if you start and make your way into the process in the smaller project.
All right, I'd like to thank you all. So the next presentation of this lecture series is on July 13th. We're moving away from public buildings and spaces to housing. So we're going to do affordable housing on July 13th, then move into multi-family housing, which is interesting. And then go to small scale. Everybody else for the next 3 months. So we have July and August and September. Thank you all for being here. There were some great questions online. Thank you all for being here online. It was really hard to get you into this conversation, so please show up next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.